Hi, my name's Nancy Hawk. I'm the Executive Director of Basic Rights Oregon, and welcome to our weekly Queer Town Hall. Today we're going to talk about suicide prevention because September is National Suicide Prevention Awareness Month. During this month, individuals and organizations alike will be drawing attention to the problems of suicide and advocate for prevention. Suicide is a national health problem that currently ranks as the second leading cause of death for ages 10 to 24. Suicide is also one of the leading causes of preventable death in our nation. In the LGBTQ community, each time a person is a victim of physical or verbal harassment or abuse, they become 2.5 times more likely to hurt themselves. 41% of trans adults said that they have attempted suicide in a 2015 study. Studies have also shown that Black, Latino, Indigenous, and Asian Americans who are LGBTQ attempt suicide at rates higher than the general population. And the one thing we need to always remember is that behind these statistics, behind these numbers are people. There's a trans kid who needs support at school, or a queer adult who finds themselves in an unaffirming, hostile workplace. So it's up to us, all of us, to use not only this month, but all year long to show LGBTQ kids and adults that there's a future for themselves, or there's a future for them, and that there's a whole community that's behind them, ready to fight for them. And that's how our community responded when we tragically lost Addie Staub, a beloved trans teenager in Portland who died by suicide in 2017. We worked with her family and Oregon legislators to bring Addie's Act into being, which provides model suicide prevention policy to all of Oregon school districts. And as the school year begins, we hope it's going to make a real difference in the lives of LGBTQ youth. And we won't stop there. We have to keep going. We have to keep striving to ensure that our friends and neighbors have the kind of mental health support people need. And it means ensuring basics like housing, food security, and healthcare access are all met. And it means we will never stop fighting for equality. And just a reminder to folks who are watching that we have some amazing people here with us tonight, but this is not a therapeutic session. And we recognize that talking about suicide can bring up difficult emotions, and we want you to be able to take care of yourself. If you are struggling, if you need someone to talk to, there are resources available for you. They're in the event description, and we'll also share them in the chat. And as usual, please drop your questions for panelists in the chat section or your comments. And as usual, you'll be entered to win a Protect Trans Kids tote bag. So let's get started. We have some amazing panelists here with us tonight. And as usual, I will ask people to introduce themselves in alphabetical order, and we'll start with Bree. And I'm going to ask your name, your pronouns, I guess, multiple, your organization, a little bit about what you do there, and my new for fall icebreaker, the best book or show you've watched or read since the pandemic began. It's my selfish question because the rain's going to start soon. Need to get my fall reading and watch list together. So, Bree, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Nancy. My name is Bree Barnett. I'm the Director of Development and Interim Director of Communications at Trans Lifeline, where we are proud to be the largest direct service provider to trans people in North America. My role at the organization is to really oversee the growth of our organization so we can continue to meet more of our community's need and hopefully one day really be able to make it so that whenever there is a trans person in crisis in the US or Canada, we will be able to answer that call every time. That's always the goal. And in terms, my pronouns are they and she, and the media I've enjoyed most in quarantine, although it was hard, was I May Destroy You, which as a survivor of sexual trauma myself, normally is very charged but I found this to be the most comprehensive and nuanced depiction that actually felt good and felt seen to watch. And so I will pass it over to Jim.
Thank you. And I wrote that title down.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jim Hanson. I go by he, him pronouns. I'm the school psychologist at Lincoln High School and have been for about the past 20 years. Lincoln had the unfortunate history of having the most suicides of any high school in Oregon. And we had to take a really serious look at that and see what we could do. So we really worked hard on that and now have some really great programs that I'm really proud of. And we haven't lost a student to suicide in 13 years. So I'm very happy that you asked the question about what we liked. I have 2 books. You can probably see behind me. I'm a big book fan. One of them is called Conflict is Not Abuse. And like a real geek, I do have my other book right here by me, which is Ken Wilber in Dialogue, Conversations with Leading Transpersonal Thinkers. So that's a real barn burner right there.
Thank you. Wow, both sound really interesting. Kaheya, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely, thank you. My name is Kaheya Reichmann. I go by she, her pronouns. I am the School Suicide Prevention and Wellness Program Manager at Lines for Life, which means that my job was created in response to Addie's Act passing through the Oregon legislature. I am providing technical assistance and consultation to school districts across the state of Oregon about how do you write and actually implement really effective suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention policy. And so I've been doing a lot of work with school districts all across our huge state, and I'm just really excited to talk more about this topic today. And as far as books or other media, I am super huge into podcasts. If I'm not on a call during my workday, I'm usually listening to a podcast. And I am really enjoying a podcast called Sawbones, which is a medical history podcast. And it's just really, really interesting. I'm usually a little bit woozy about medical topics, but it definitely has captured my attention. And so I've been really enjoying that.
That's great. Thank you. Kris, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Kris Bifulco. I use she and they pronouns. I'm wearing a couple of different hats in the landscape of suicide prevention work in the state of Oregon. My job title is as the Connect Postvention Coordinator for the state, so I help train folks in suicide postvention, which is the response that happens after a suicide death in a community. But I'm also here representing the Oregon Alliance to Prevent Suicide, which is a statewide alliance that works on policy for suicide prevention for youth. And I'm a member of their LGBTQ advisory group. So I'll be talking mostly from that lens tonight. And then my quarantine book recommendation is a book called Love and Rage, which is, I think the subtitle is The Path to Liberation Through Anger by Lama Rod Owens. He's a queer Black Buddhist teacher and social justice activist. And really just, it's a wonderful kind of part memoir, part meditation on the role of anger and our relationship with it.
Wow. That sounds amazing. Thanks. I wrote that one down as well. Sophia, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. So I'm Sophia, she, her, they, them pronouns. I'm a volunteer at YouthLine. So what that looks like is answering calls from peers in crisis. So that's anything from just stress about homework to suicidal ideation. It also looks like outreach in classrooms and at events like this one. Over quarantine, I've had a whole book list. I've been doing a lot of reading, but Audre Lorde is my favorite author of all time, and I read her book Zammy over quarantine. It feels like ages ago, but I promise it was during quarantine. And it's just so beautifully written and lyrical and well done. So yeah.
Wow, that is an amazing book. I love that book. When I read it 25 years ago, still love it. Also, I will give my own recommendation. On Earth, We're Briefly Gorgeous. It is a beautiful, beautiful novel, very poetic, very lyrical. And I use she, her pronouns. And so thank you all for being with us tonight and talking about something that's sometimes really hard to talk about. And until we started working on Addie's Act, I'd never spoken publicly about suicide. And I think that when I was thinking about today and what we're going to talk about, I was thinking also about, like, how do we have the bigger conversation about our communities and what our communities need to survive? And I was thinking about a coworker that I used to work with several years ago, Walida Imarisha. And when I was working with her, she started talking about organizing and, started doing this social justice work as science fiction. And so before I start my first question, I'm just going to give this quote of hers. Science fiction is the only genre that not only allows you to disregard everything that we're taught is realistic and practical, but actually demands that you do. So it allows us to move beyond the bounds of what is realistic and what is real into the realm of the imagination. That is actually something that organizers do every single day. All organizing is science fiction. When organizers imagine a world without poverty, without war, without borders or prisons, that's science fiction. They're moving beyond the boundaries of what is possible or realistic into the realm of what we're told is possible. Being able to collectively dream those new worlds means that we begin to create those new worlds here. So, end quote. Not my words, but I find them really inspiring. And so I just sort of imagining you all as organizers who are fighting to build this new world. Let's just talk about what it looked like, without we don't have the budget for that. What is the world we're trying to build around suicide prevention? And what are we dreaming of? What would we have? What would our communities have if they had all the resources they needed? And I know it's a big question to start. I just didn't want to keep it to the end. I didn't want to run out of time because I know you all have a lot of great thoughts. Can I ask you, Jim, to start us off?
Thanks, Nancy. That is a really tough question for me to answer. I think that right now I am so concerned about short-term actions and affairs. The election is looming near. We've lost a Supreme Court justice. That so many of those concerns are so immediate for me. Sometimes I haven't thought too much about what a suicide-free community would really look like. So I really appreciate that question. I would love it if we had a society where we had a guaranteed income, where we had the social supports that are necessary for physical and mental health. I would love just even civil dialogue back in the political sphere. I'd like to have this feeling of us rather than I'm against you. I think that some of those systemic issues, they're the dream. And absolutely that every kid has the resources that they need at home and at school for health and for mental health.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for kicking us off. Should we go? Well, you work at a high school. Sophia, you're in high school. Can I ask you about what you think about with this really huge question?
Yeah, absolutely. I think school is a really big part of this question. And I think that removing any barriers for kids getting help, I know that a lot of people struggle, I have a school counselor, but I've only talked to them during the mandatory check-in at the beginning of the year or whatever. Making it so that we have spaces where we can check in or be silent, and just really letting kids know that, yes, education is a priority, but mental health is an integral part of education. I also think representation is really huge, and this gets talked about a lot, but I think it's worth saying because I recently came across a BuzzFeed article, and it was 20 21 movies for like that have like good Black queer representation, and I'm like, that's great, but you could only find 21. Like for like, I think just starting like as you're young and just seeing people like you on screen or in books makes a huge difference. So
yeah, I think that's very true. And you know, kids spend so much time in school, even online school, and I have a first grader, and it's been actually very inspiring to me. And he's in a pod with a second grader, and just hearing how much time the first and second grade teachers are spending checking in with all their students, even though it's through a computer screen, about how they're feeling and about emotions and about, you know, the state has literally been on fire, and these kids are trying to, you know, be on Zoom calls, and they're 6 years old, right? It just feels really hard. And so I've just been really inspired by how much time the teachers are spending just having that, trying to have that heart to heart, even through a Zoom. And I think it's really important that people make that time. So, yeah. And then, Bree, I feel like you work for an organization that was a dream for trans folks that came to reality. What do you think?
Thank you so much for this question. I think it's so important. And I think something that we're big advocates of here at Trans Lifeline is thinking about how people can show up and support each other. And I think there needs to be structural support behind that too. When I think about my dream for suicide prevention, it includes things like, you know, reparations to Black people. It includes things like finding a way to give land back and be in right relationship with Indigenous people. I'm not sure how we as a nation, how we collectively can teach people to heal from the trauma of their past if we as a nation are not willing to look at and seriously heal from the core traumas of our past. I think about a world where we really have access. Everyone has access to medical care and mental health care that can be so expensive and so prohibitive for people. I think about a world where the environment is thriving alongside us. I think it's hard to tell people that you should want more of the future when people might look really naturally around them at a world literally on fire and think, oh, is this going to be it continuing? I think so much about these material things because while we know that trans people experience suicidality at way disproportionate rates, really that's about the material conditions of what it means to be trans. That's about things like discrimination, harassment. That's about things like not being able to access good jobs, consistent health care. And so a society that's really meeting those needs for everyone is a society that people are going to want more of, lives they're going to want more of.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you. Anyone else want to jump in on this big, broad question about the world we want to build? Well, I know that, Kris, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I was just going to add to those amazing answers that I also think of a world where people can follow their passions and do it with everything in them and not be afraid of how they're going to make ends meet. I think we have so many other concerns related to the economy or related to survival that our, the essence of who we are is sometimes compromised in that process. So I dream of a place where we can all be really free to follow our passions, encouraged to do that, to show up as an entire person and loved for it and to feel that love.
Yeah. Yes. Yes, I want that for people too. All of these things. And I know that in all of your work, right, you're trying to build the programs that are changing things. And so why don't I start with Jim and talk a little bit about what you did at Lincoln to turn things around. What were those changes and shifts that happened in one school that shifted things for the kids there?
Well, thanks. I came to Lincoln in 2001, and I was the school psychologist. I was there half-time. And I noticed that we were losing students almost every year to suicide. And there was a lot of care and there was a lot of concern, but we weren't being necessarily proactive. So in 2007, I actually got together with one of our parents. We have what's called a Cardinal Families Health Action Network, and they're a group of parents that are concerned about health and mental health at Lincoln. And I said, Mike, we've got to go do something about this. So we went shopping. We went shopping for best practices, evidence-based practices for suicide prevention. And we went out and heard a presentation on the Response program, Response, the high school-based suicide awareness program. We liked it. We brought it back to our school counselors and administration and health teachers and said, what do you think of this program? Here are another couple of programs that we can take a look at. We really liked Response. It was 4 days of training for students in recognizing the signs of suicide and depression, and then some very, very basic and empowering skills so that students could talk to their friends about suicide and feel more comfortable with it. And they will feel more comfortable about asking directly if their friend was thinking about suicide. And also there's a staff component. This Friday I get to teach staff again. There's a parent component as well. And that, in combination with bringing in our dialectical behavioral therapy program, so universal prevention and a good targeted support for students, that made all the difference. And in those ensuing years, we developed more programs and more supports for kids. I'm not going to go over them all, but our teachers, our administration, our counselors, our parents, our students, we've really worked hard and we've worked together. We have really, I think that's one of the keys in a school, is we can't be working separately. We have to all be working together, and we have to bring in our community partners and our parents as well. I'll just list some of the programs that we do have. An emphasis on personal relationships, huge equity, social environmental justice, critical race studies, student unions, including GSA, Brothers and Sisters of Color, METCHA, restorative justice programs, sources of strength, which is student-led suicide prevention, student-led research-informed anti-bullying, SAFER. We have mindfulness, yoga, the Yale Science of Wellbeing course, acceptance and commitment therapy, suicide screenings and safety plans, and our comprehensive school-based dialectical behavioral therapy. I say all that, and I don't want people to be overwhelmed, because that system, we developed our multi-tiered system of supports. That's taken us 13 years of solid, dedicated work. And we're very happy because we've been able to make adaptations to those programs that really fit the needs of our kids, our BIPOC students, our students with disabilities, our LGBTQI2S students, so that they are represented. I agree with Sophia very much. Representation really, really matters. So we've been able to gauge the effectiveness of those programs, and hopefully now we can sustain them. Hopefully we can move forward with them in a really good way.
This is why I don't mute myself ever. So thank you for that, Jim. And I know, Kaheya, that you're also working with schools on how they're building systems to prevent suicide. Do you want to talk a little bit about your work?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's really exciting that there has been so much investment since Addie's Act passed in Oregon to help support school districts with this work. Our program has a couple of different components that I feel really excited about. One component is that we developed as an agency at Lines for Life our step-by-step guide, which is an interactive workbook for school districts that has sample plans. It has checklists of, what do you already have and what do we need to work on or support. It also has recommendations for training and curriculum, like response, like Jim was talking about, is in there. So we're recommending that to schools and saying that this is a program that's working for schools in Oregon. And then we also have some tangible support in the world that we live in right now, too. So one of the things that's really exciting is that we have a mini grant program so that school districts can apply for funding to support this effort. So they can get up to $1,500 to support their Addie's Act funding. And so that can apply to a lot of different things. It can apply to paying for substitute teachers so that teachers can go to a mental health first aid training, for example, or it can pay for purchasing the response curriculum for their high schools. So things where if I'm getting resistance from a school district because of funding, because that's a very, very real position that a lot of schools are in right now, I can say, well, actually, I can help you with that, which has felt really good, instead of just providing, I'm so sorry that you can't have that funding right now. So providing that tangible and realistic support, I think, is also helpful, that we're not all just talking about doing this, that we're actually doing something, is really important. And then I also think that I try really hard with my work with schools to emphasize that this is the whole systems approach. So one person cannot take all of this work on by themselves. It is so lovely to have a champion for suicide prevention in a school, but when we start piling every single thing onto that one person, that is a recipe not only for burnout, but it allows kids to fall through the cracks in terms of where our system isn't serving certain students. And so we really need to bring in the administration. We need to get investment from all levels of teachers. We need to train folks like janitors and bus drivers and lunch folks that work in the cafeteria, right? I believe really strongly that those folks are kind of the real boots on the ground in this system, and we can't forget them when we're thinking about a macro level approach to what we do in suicide prevention in schools.
Thank you. Thanks for that. It feels like a lot of things are happening in the schools, and I know, Kris, you're working on a statewide level with the Alliance. Can you talk a little bit about some of the statewide programs that are happening around suicide prevention?
Sure. And I'll just mention, since this is Suicide Prevention Month, one of the initiatives that we have going on is through our Healthy Transitions work group. We have a bunch of different work groups underneath the Alliance, and right now we're collecting and sharing stories from youth and young adults about maybe experience with suicidality, with coping, with resilience. They're accepting submissions throughout the month of September, so you can find that on the Oregon Alliance to Prevent Suicide website if you know a young person, or if you are a young person who has something that you want to share about suicide or about your experience with helping a loved one. They're accepting podcasts, art, any sort of expression that you want to share with that. The other thing that I'll mention for what we're doing is we were recently really fortunate to get a bunch of funding from the Oregon Health Authority to put out into the community in the form of mini grants for projects specifically for the LGBTQ community, with further priority given to BIPOC, rural, frontier, disabled, community-focused projects. We received 80 applications from 30 out of the 36 counties in the state, and we were able to fund 18 projects to do suicide prevention related work that fits for that community. So it's things like access to gender affirming care sort of supports, whether that's funding to be able to purchase a binder, or that's a sponsorship to go to therapy, or to get assessments. I know a lot of our partners have had to put that on hold because of COVID, so we're able to help resume those activities. We're seeing a student-led podcast as pop up as a result of that. We'll have a press release about it tomorrow, so you can read about all 18 of them. They're really amazing projects, and I can't speak highly enough about those partners. And really what that whole mini grant showed us is that we have a high need throughout the state, and we have a big community that we can put support out to. So I think this is something that an area of focus we're going to have moving forward.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I love hearing about those resources, especially all throughout Oregon, and not just based in Portland. And I know, Bree, you're based in California, but you have a lot of experience working with the trans community on helping folks get resources they need. Can you just talk a little bit about that piece? Because I feel like when we were talking about the larger questions, there's like so much about like meeting people's basic needs. And in healthcare and gender affirming care being part of that equation.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, this is something we think a lot about at Trans Lifeline. It's why I think we're best known for our hotline, but it's why we also have a microgrants program to give trans people money to legally change their name and gender, update their IDs, which is what we've chosen so far for our microgrants program, because IDs can be so discreet, and it's a relatively small investment. The average ID costs around $500, but you're talking about easier access to jobs, education, easier ability to go to the store. And if someone asks for your ID when you're using your credit card, not be outed and not face harassment, just such a necessary intervention in that way. And, you know, we would love to be able to offer support for other things like medical transition, rent, so many things, right? But also we've really learned through our ID program that the need of the community is just so great that it's about making those interventions where you can. And so for us right now, that's IDs. We've also expanded a bit to offering some commissary support for trans people who are imprisoned or in detention facilities to help make their life a little bit easier. Thinking about where we can make strategic interventions, because unfortunately, while we are still operating in a scarcity mode, that's probably not necessary as a nation. I think it's still, just because you can't necessarily meet the full need of something doesn't mean that you can't get involved in things like resource redistribution that can really make a powerful difference.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And I feel like I want to get to our first question that we got from an audience member, which is, I've seen a lot going around during Suicide Prevention Awareness Month that says to go beyond just asking friends, how are you doing? But how do I broach this subject with people who I think might be struggling? It seems weird to just ask, are you suicidal? But I'm not sure. And so I know all of you have experience with this kind of question. Sophia, do you have a thought around it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is something that we talk about at YouthLine a lot too. Sorry, there's yard work happening. I hope you can hear me. Yes. Is when you're in doubt, ask the question. And I think what's especially important is asking the question directly. Are you thinking about suicide? Are you thinking about killing yourself? Do you want to end your life? Because while it can feel uncomfortable and feel blunt, like it's going to be worth it in the end. And I think even if the answer is, oh no, absolutely not, like I'm just having a bad day or whatever, being able to use that language will help other people to use that language. And I think especially among youth, because a lot of the time I feel like there's a little bit of weight taken away because of the amount of jokes people make about suicide, or just casually saying like, I want to kill myself, if they don't mean it, and you never know if they mean it unless you ask the question. So yeah, I think using blunt language and asking when you're in doubt is really important.
Yeah, I think that's right. Does anyone have anything to add to that?
I think that was a great answer. Thank you, Sophia. I think that another thing that I would add, just to speak to that like awkward, blunt feeling, is something that we talk about on YouthLine and just in general when we're talking about suicide, is using language that that just states what you noticed about a person. So you're concerned about them for some reason, right? So maybe you're saying, hey, I feel really worried about you because I noticed that you're not showing up to our D&D sessions as much as you used to, or I feel really worried because you posted this thing on social media that makes me think you might be suicidal. So that you're giving context to why you're asking, and you're also stating that you notice and you care of what this person is doing or not doing, or where they're occupying their spaces, right? And so I think that can be really, in my experience, that's been really helpful in approaching and starting that conversation with somebody that where you just have this gut feeling and you're worried about them in that moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. And so part of the conversation we've been having is, around getting people the support they need, whether it's like to live their dreams or just be able to like live and not worry about health insurance and everything every minute of the day. And I feel like, is there like, what is the conversation in suicide prevention world around meeting people's basic needs? And is it a conversation? I mean, it feels, especially in BIPOC communities and especially in trans communities, that so much of the stress is around not being able to meet basic needs. And it feels, in 2020, that's particularly true, right? With the high unemployment and loss of healthcare because it's tied to your job, and et cetera, that we all know. Do folks want to speak to some of the conversations that are happening around that and suicide in the work you do?
I'll jump in because it is something that we talk about so much here at Trans Lifeline. And I think it's what I'd like to say is it's important to bring that to like personal check-ins with people, to acknowledge that if you're talking to a friend who's hurting, sometimes people are hurting because they're being hurt. Sometimes they're unsure about the future because they're being targeted if they're trans or they're a person of color. Maybe they're actually experiencing real discrimination that makes them really afraid of being able to have a life that's worth living materially. And I think being able to meet people not just from you need emotional support or you're struggling because you're struggling, but meet them and being able to acknowledge that pain and hardship interpersonally is important. And then, of course, being involved in any way that you can in larger movements to help change those realities is important, but it's important at every level.
Yeah, thank you. What do you have, Jim?
Well, I'll show you a little bit of our suicide prevention presentation to staff next Friday. I think a lot of suicide prevention work has really concentrated on like the warning signs of suicide and risk factors for suicide. And it really hasn't examined some of the other factors that we're talking about now. This is a diagram from the National CARES mentoring movement and Association of Black Psychologists. It came out last year, 2019, from a report called the Black Child Suicide Report. And I apologize, this is not the best way to present something, but it talks about these circles with the person in the middle and the factors that might be impairing. all the way from multi-generational historical trauma to systemic and institutional racism and violence, community violence, down to the person and the adverse childhood experiences that they may have had, bullying and microaggressions that they may have had at school, and then down to even something simple like breaking up with a friend or a romantic partner. So we can see all these multiple levels of stressors that might be present in a person's life. And I think instead of just concentrating on the bullying and microaggressions and just breaking up with a friend or those immediate risk factors, I think in suicide prevention work, we really do kind of need to back up and say social justice is really a part of this. Economic justice is really a part of suicide prevention work. So it's important to address those levels as well as the individual levels.
Yeah, I think that's great that conversation is happening, but how do you address it in your school, in a school, when, it feels like schools are being asked to do so much.
I think that students really have a passion for this themselves. I can speak to that. As soon as we talked about anti-bullying, students wanted to be on board and talk with other students about that. With social justice, at least once or twice during the year, our students pretty much downtown, they walk across the 405 bridge and they are downtown and at demonstrations. And there is just this power. Many of our high schools have critical race studies classes. We have environmental justice classes at Lincoln as well. I think that youth are our best resource in making these macro level changes. So I would really be interested to hear about what others have to say about what students can do to change our society.
Sophia, what did you think of that graphic and sort of looking at those bigger systems?
Yeah, no, for sure. I think that's incredibly important. And I think the conversation around trauma is becoming more prevalent, but I still think it's important to recognize just how real it is and how real internalized racism is and how real internalized homophobia is, because I think it can be hard even for the people experiencing it to identify what it is. I think that this kind of those kinds of symptoms are normalized, and so BIPOC, LGBTQ plus people aren't recognizing that, this is trauma, this is societal, because that's a lot for one person to recognize themselves. So I think that needs to be a bigger conversation in healthcare too. I think it's people, there's always a focus on trying to get a diagnosis, which is important for medication, and it's important for certain things. I also think sometimes I'm suspicious of diagnoses of BIPOC because it's but there's also all of this trauma that could create just the same symptoms, and it doesn't really matter what name we give it. So I think just recognizing what a real thing it is really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I feel like there's still, there's so much stigma still in our society around mental health struggles around poverty, around all struggles really, and that are traumatizing. And, I think that we're at a place where we need to, I don't know, I believe in destigmatizing everything. Let's talk about all the things, and not have shame around any of them. And also, I just want to point out, we've brought up representation, and it feels like there's a lack of representation in the suicide prevention world of people of color. And I just sort of want to hear a little bit about what your organizations are doing around sort of improving that and making the change around making sure that more people of color are represented in the work.
Something that's really important at YouthLine is our youth volunteers. And I think that the power of peer work is so I think it's the future of this movement, to be honest. I think that not just for youth, but peer work in all populations, I think is so important. And one thing that we have been thinking about is how do we very intentionally build a space where we're not only welcoming to all of our youth volunteers, but we are intentionally making sure that we are not a volunteer base that is all white, or a volunteer base that is all heterosexual, or some, things like that. Making sure that we've got that diversity of our space so that we can provide that to our callers and folks that contact us as a peer lens. And I think that comes a lot from just the power of our youth volunteers and their ability to speak to their experiences and their ability to reflect and share about why this work is important to them. And so that's always, I'm constantly impressed by that. And I think that it takes at least in my experience, it takes intentionality from an organization, from all levels of an organization, including leadership, to make those changes really happen. And that includes having these hard conversations around, the history of our organization and the future of our organization and how we're going to build up those voices. And I also think that in terms of specifically the queer and trans population, I just know from my experience growing up as a queer kid in Oregon, we know that kids go to each other before they go to supportive adults in their lives most of the time when they're talking about things like suicide or mental health issues. And so we have to make sure that we're destigmatizing that so that young folks know that when their friends are talking about this, when their peers are talking about this kind of stuff, that they know who to go to for help. So they're not shouldering all of that on their own and having these really scary conversations. I just remember being on like AOL Instant Messenger late at night with friends and talking about suicide. I was like a 13-year-old, and that was really scary. And so trying to listen to our youth and to empower them to use their voice to change this movement is really important.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I won't ask what your Instant Messenger username was. So
please don't. I decline to answer.
But yeah, I think that peer-to-peer support is so important, and I know that's a lot of what you do at Trans Lifeline. Can you just talk about the difference that makes?
Yes, I just want to underline everything that was just said, because peer support is the magic. Peer support is meeting people where they are and from shared experience. And when you're doing peer support, here at Trans Lifeline, we talk about so many different issues with callers, like suicidality is the reason we were founded, but we're talking to callers, especially with shelter-in-place orders, about things like domestic and intimate partner violence. We're talking to people about job loss. We're talking economic insecurity. We're talking about all these things because all these things are mental health, and you can't just neatly silo conversations. And we're able to do that because our operators are trans, and so people are able to assume commonality. I think also when we're talking about issues of racial justice, we have some learnings to share with peer support, and that peer support means that our operators have agency too. So if callers are being racially abusive or racist, it's important to us that our operators, especially our operators of color, it's their right to end that conversation as well, right? They don't have to be subjected to that abuse. They don't have to have their mental health impacted in that way, is something that we want to see, across people doing this type of service provision. Similarly, we've found that when it comes to peer support, it's really important that we as an organization have explicit goals around what the representation of our leadership is, what the representation of our staff are, and that those goals not always be used in catch-all terms like people of color, but like very specifically about how many Black staff we have, how many Black leadership we have, in order to explicitly address, anti-Blackness that can be inherent in an organization that wasn't founded by Black people, right? And so I think all of those are important steps that we're currently taking and we're learning. And I think peer support really is then lifting up, like not just settling for one generic label like, oh, a trans operator, but really how many different aspects of identity can people be connecting on? And the more overlap there is the better the support is going to be.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Bree. And actually, I just feel like peer support is so important, whether you're a youth or like in the trans community, or just like I have a friend who set up peer support for workers who are laid off, like when a big factory was shut down, or she worked with miners when they shut down a factory in Poland that had been active for 700 years, and what actually helped prevent suicide was the peer-to-peer support. And I think that's so important in setting up those groups and making sure those groups were supported. And so, yeah, it's amazing. I hadn't thought about that in a long time, but I just feel like it's important. It feels like people are recognizing too that it's not just about giving someone a diagnosis and trying to get them on the right medication, because that's important, but this other piece, which is about peer-to-peer, but also about building that community of support and love around folks. Kris, do you want to talk a little bit about the efforts that you see happening?
Yeah, one of the things that I do want to mention too in regard to the field of suicide prevention and representation is that another area we really need to look into is data. The way that our systems work. We have to, provide data, collect data, but what people are looking at is kind of census level data, which does not tell us the true stories of people who are out there. It really just lumps together groups of folks and doesn't serve us in the way that we know that data can serve us. So one of the things that we are talking about is how do we disaggregate our data? How do we get those stories? Because the way that we currently look at data, we're missing large changes in certain groups. And so then funds and efforts are not pushed in that direction. And even though we might be talking with our community members and hearing this is a huge problem, the way that we have access to data doesn't support that, and so then that money goes elsewhere. So that's something that we fundamentally need to change, and that's something that I think is gaining some momentum right now, is some advocacy efforts around we need more data on, Asian communities. Well, who are you talking about specifically? Like what Bree was saying, we need to be really specific, and we need to know. And we need to also make a data process less traumatizing and divorce it from that history that research, data collection, whatever has in harming communities of color, in harming queer communities, and in harming people in general. So there's a lot that can be done with that. And so I think for us too at the Alliance, we're engaging in a process of self-reflection, and the ways that we run things, does that uphold systems of oppression, and how? And how can we change that so that we can have a better process for the state of Oregon, so that we can really hear stories from people, and so that we can make bigger changes.
Thank you for that. And I can't believe it, but we're at the 5-minute mark. So I'm going to give everybody, there's 5 of you, 5 minutes. You have 1 minute to make any closing comments and anything you'd like to share with folks who are watching. And I'd love to start with you, Sophia, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So one thing that came up for me as we were talking was a little bit more about education. And I think one thing that's maybe less a systematic, tangible thing, but more of just like, I want everyone to change their mindset. No, but also just, I feel like throughout my education, I've been fed this narrative that's like, you're in 2nd grade so that you can get to 3rd grade, so that you can get to middle school, so that you can get to high school, so that you can go to college, so that you can get a job. And it's constantly thinking ahead. Like, as young as like first grade, like, oh, in second grade, teachers will recycle your paper if you don't put your name on it. And I think that communicates to people, like, I'm always here for the next step. And then that can cause a lot of anxiety when you don't know what the next step is. When you're in high school and suddenly it's like, okay, well, once you're out of here, you got to be ready. And we're like, for what? So I think that changing the narrative around education, like, why are we here? We're here to build connections, and we're here to learn more about ourselves and about other people, is really important.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, be present in where you are. That's so important. So usually I've gone Jim and then Sophia. So now I'll go Sophia and then Jim. Give you a minute.
Okay, thank you. Well, I want to get back to that question about representation because I do feel it's so important, both in the data but also in the programs that we use. A day a week, I'll be working with Portland Public Schools to bring in comprehensive school-based dialectical behavioral therapy to other schools. And in doing that, I think it's really important to talk about evidence-based practices and to say how well do those represent minorities, people of color, LGBT people. So we have an advisory council of people of color and of LGBT people. In fact, Aiden Campbell will be a part of that advisory to make sure that whatever we offer in our schools really does represent the students that we're serving. And also what has been written by Indigenous people or what has been written by people of color for people of color. I'm also working with the district and bringing in an adaptation called Discovering Our Story for Schools. And that is Native Americans telling their stories of resilience in different areas of health and mental health, because I think it's so important to have that voice of communities helping communities, and not only and reaching out to help the broad community as well. So hopefully we'll hear more in our health curriculum of those Indigenous voices and that Indigenous wisdom as well.
Great, thank you. Bree, would you like to close us out with your minute? I mean, your last minute.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been so lovely to be here. Thank you for having me. And would just tell people that, you know, the power of connection, and in my experience, especially the power of connection on shared identity, can be absolutely transformative. And so, you know, seek out those folks who are like you, that share important aspects of your identity, and connect on how you can make change, connect on supporting each other. Trans Lifeline, we're now 6 years old. I don't think many people thought that we could be a thing. And sometimes when I go into the comment section on articles about us, because I can't help myself, of common sentiment people type is, what's next? Schizophrenics hotline for schizophrenics. And I'm just kind of like, you know, that's actually a really good idea. You're threatening us with a good time right now. Which is just to say that, like, it's possible. It's possible. And I really believe in us. We're all we have, and thankfully we're all we need.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you. And yeah, I'm so happy that Trans Lifeline exists. What an incredible resource. Kris, your closing minute.
Sure. I want people to know that if you want to get involved in our efforts, there are ways to do that. All of our meetings are open to the public, so whether you are an official member of the Alliance or not, you are welcome to have these conversations with us and to be part of it. So all of our schedule for these meetings is up on the Oregon Alliance to Prevent Suicide website, and this is an open invitation to folks who want to get involved and to be part of our community. So I'll just leave it there, and I hope to meet a whole lot of new people.
Great, thank you. And Kaheya, gonna close us out?
Oh, I get the final statement. I think that what I keep coming back to in this conversation is that suicide prevention and Suicide Prevention Month is so much more than just posting the National Suicide Lifeline number on your Instagram page and moving on. That's great. I think that we can come together as a community to really look at why people are dying by suicide and what can we learn from that and move forward while still honoring the folks in our community that we have lost. I think that it's so important to think about this as a systems level issue, while also getting people the individualized support that they need, and also not putting all of the onus on the person who's hurting to reach out. I think that telling people you should call the Lifeline rather than maybe I should help you do that, or maybe I can help get you the support or the resources that you need. That's like a subtle shift that we can make in our culture to prevent suicide in a lot more meaningful way, I think.
Great. Thank you for that. So thank you all so much for tackling this topic. Let's keep building the world we want to live in, for us and our community and the future generations. So thank you all, and we'll see you another time. And thanks for tuning in to Queer Town Hall. Have a good night, everyone.